The thing about being a fire demon was that you noticed temperature before you noticed anything else. Not temperature the way humans noticed it. That blunt, slow awareness of warm or cold that made them put on scarves or open windows. Fire demons felt temperature the way bats felt sound, as a detailed three-dimensional landscape of shifting gradients, air currents, thermal pockets, and radiative exchanges that mapped the entire building around them in constant, exhausting detail. Calcifer could tell without looking that the kitchen was 3 degrees cooler than yesterday because the castle had moved the east-facing window 6 inches to the left overnight. He could feel the draft from the badly sealed bathroom door, the residual warmth of Morgan's cot 2 rooms away, and the small cold spot under the stairs where a mouse had been living since November and thought nobody had noticed. The mouse had been noticed. Calcifer had opinions about the mouse. The mouse was irrelevant right now. What was relevant was that Sophie had left at dawn for Stump End. She'd promised the Cotters a return visit, and Sophie kept her promises with the inevitability of weather. And Howl was in Kingsbury doing whatever it was Howl did in Kingsbury, which probably involved 3 wardrobe changes and at least 1 mirror. And this meant that Calcifer was alone in the castle with Morgan, midnight, and whatever mood the building had decided to be in today. The building was in a mood. Calcifer could feel it in the walls. Not just temperature this time. The whole structure was tense, a faint, constant vibration in the load-bearing beams, like a dog trembling before a thunderstorm. The pipes in the bathroom wall were humming at a frequency that Calcifer, who had been forced to listen to the bathroom's musical opinions for months now, did not recognize. It wasn't the sea shanty. It wasn't the starlight orchid melody. It wasn't even the lullaby phase, which had been creepy enough. It was a low, atonal drone that rose and fell with no discernible pattern, and which made the mortar between the hearthstones itch. "Stop that," Calcifer said to the wall. "Whatever you're doing, stop it." The wall did not stop. The vibration shifted half a tone higher. The pipes added a harmonic. "I mean it. I will heat every flagstone in this kitchen to uncomfortable, and I will not feel guilty about it." The vibration paused, just long enough to feel pointed, and then resumed at exactly the same frequency. Calcifer settled his flames and tried to ignore it. This was, he reflected, the fundamental problem with living in a building that had opinions. You couldn't argue with a castle. You couldn't reason with it. It didn't have a brain, not in any way that counted. Just decades of accumulated magical charge and the kind of architectural stubbornness that came from being made of stone and having stood in the same spot for longer than most people had been alive. Howl's castle had walked, of course, which made it unusual, and it had been powered by a fire demon, by him, which made it more unusual still, but none of that translated into what you'd call intelligence. The castle didn't think, it felt. And what it was feeling right now was something between a sulk and a siege. It had started. Calcifer had been tracking this because someone had to, and everyone else was too busy being human about it, roughly 3 weeks after Christmas. Small things at first. The broom cupboard rearranging itself, stairs creaking in new and unnecessary keys. The bathroom, which had always been argumentative, developing what could only be called a creative practice. Then bigger things. Furniture migrating overnight. The conservatory door sticking when Sage tried to visit. The front door opening with a grudging resistance that even Sophie, who was not always the most observant person about buildings' emotional states, she was more attuned to people's emotional states, which was arguably a more useful skill but left a gap in the household's diagnostic capabilities, had started to notice. And then the stairs. The stairs had been the real escalation, rearranging themselves so that every route from the bedrooms led to the conservatory, which was the castle's way of saying, "Look at what I have. Look at the orchids. Look at the beautiful things I grew. Pay attention to me." Sophie had spent 20 minutes walking in loops before she'd figured it out and told the castle, firmly, to put the stairs back. It had. But the point had been made. The point, Calcifer understood with the bone-deep certainty of someone who had spent years as this building's literal heart, was, "You are leaving me, not physically." Sophie still slept here every night, ate breakfast at the kitchen table, answered her letters by the fire. Howl still occupied the bathroom for unconscionable stretches. Morgan still set small fires in his cot, and Midnight still ate the bad dreams that collected in the corners like dust. Nobody was leaving, but Sophie's attention was going elsewhere, to the letters, to Stump End, to Keeper's cottage next door, to the expanding web of magical correspondence that was pulling her focus outward like thread unspooling from a bobbin. And the castle felt it the way Calcifer felt a draft, as an absence, a cooling. He understood it better than he wanted to. Morgan announced his awakeness with a small explosion, not a dangerous explosion. Morgan's fire-breathing had settled, over the past months, into a more or less predictable pattern. Blue flames when happy, green when startled, and a sort of cheerful orange when he wanted breakfast, which was now. The orange flame hit the ceiling above his cot, left a scorch mark in the shape of something that might have been a star or might have been a cat. Morgan's artistic intentions were unclear, and was followed by a burble of toddler satisfaction. Midnight stretched, yawned with all 6 eyes, and padded out of the nursery with the air of a cat who had been rudely interrupted from eating some very interesting nightmares and expected compensation. "Right," Calcifer said. "Breakfast." He could manage breakfast. He had managed breakfast before, on the occasions when Sophie was out and Hal was asleep, and Michael, back when Michael had lived here full-time, was buried in a spell exercise and forgot to eat until reminded. Calcifer ran the hearth. The hearth was the kitchen's heat source. Heating the kitchen was the first step of breakfast, and Calcifer was very, very good at heating things. He stoked himself up, a rush of warmth that filled the grate and pushed outward through the flagstones, warming the kitchen floor, the table, the kettle on its hook. The kettle began to steam. Good. The porridge pot was on the shelf where Sophie had left it, with a note pinned to the lid in her neat handwriting. Calcifer, porridge for Morgan, add milk, do not add anything experimental. I mean it. I added cinnamon 1 time, Calcifer muttered, adjusting his flame to the precise temperature for porridge, which was lower than people assumed. Porridge wanted patience, not power, like most things. The porridge turned out fine. Morgan liked it. The ceiling didn't need repainting for at least a week. Morgan, who had been deposited in his high chair by midnight, the dream cat was surprisingly capable with toddlers, having apparently developed parenting instincts during her 3 centuries in the between that had nothing to do with cats and everything to do with loneliness, clapped his hands and produced a burst of purple sparks. The sparks landed in his water cup and turned the water a vivid magenta. The castle creaked, not a structural creak, a communicative creak, the kind that started in the roof beams and traveled down through the walls to the floor, a slow, descending groan that Calcifer felt as a pressure change in the air around his flames. The castle was watching. It did that when it was in a mood. It watched, not with eyes, obviously, but with the diffuse awareness of a building that had been walked through and lived in and poured full of magic for decades, a building that had been given just enough life to know what attention felt like, and just enough feeling to notice when it stopped. "Don't start," Calcifer told the ceiling. The ceiling didn't start. But the pipes in the wall added another harmonic to their drone, and the kitchen table moved a 1/4 inch to the left. Calcifer heated the porridge. Morgan ate it with his hands, because Morgan ate everything with his hands, and the parts he didn't eat he offered to Midnight, who accepted them with diplomatic gravity and then discreetly deposited them on the floor when Morgan wasn't looking. This was the morning routine. Calcifer had watched it happen hundreds of times from his position in the grate, the domestic choreography of a household that functioned less by design than by stubborn habit, and he knew every step of it without needing to think. the way he knew every beam and joint and stone of this building without needing to look. He had been this building's heart for years. Bound by contract into the hearth, Howls' heart in his flames, sustaining the castle's magic and the castle's movement and the castle's existence. He had been the engine, the core, the reason the whole thing stayed up and kept walking. The castle had been built around him the way a body was built around a spine, everything depending on the central pillar, everything oriented toward the fire. And now he was free, had been free for years, stayed by choice, and the castle, which had been built to depend on him and then had that dependence severed, well, Calcifer supposed it was no wonder the thing had moods. The front door rattled, not the way a door rattles when someone knocks, the way a door rattles when it's trying to seal itself shut. Calcifer flattened himself against the grate and stretched his awareness outward. Fire demons could feel the whole building when they tried. Not clearly, not the way they felt their immediate surroundings, but as a dim thermal map, a haze of warmer and cooler spots. He felt the front door. Its hinges were hot with friction. Its latch was jammed sideways, and the wooden knob, the one with the 4 colored settings for market chipping, Kingsbury, Port Haven, and the moors, had turned itself to a position that wasn't any of the 4, a position between settings. Nowhere. "Oh, no, you don't," Calcifer said. He surged upward in the grate, his flames going tall and sharp. "You open that door right now." The castle did not open the door. The vibration in the walls increased. A pipe in the bathroom produced a sound like a sob if sobs were made of water pressure and copper. That is the front door. The front door. People need that door. Sophie needs that door. She can't get back in if you've locked it to nowhere. A long, slow creak ran through the castle from the attic to the foundations. The door didn't move. Calcifer burned. He burned hot and angry and bright, the way he had in the old days when something threatened the household, when the witch's fire demon had come, when the castle had been torn apart, when everything had been chaos and fear, and he had been the only constant, the fire in the heart, holding it all together. He poured heat into the flagstones and the walls and the ceiling and pushed it outward through every beam and joint, not to damage but to remind. He had heated these stones for years. He knew every one of them. He could make this building uncomfortable in ways it couldn't even articulate. The castle flinched. Calcifer felt it, a ripple in the thermal map, a brief contraction of the whole structure, as though the building had tried to pull away from its own walls. The door's latch released with a click. The knob turned itself back to yellow down. Market chipping. "That's what I thought," Calcifer said. But his flames were unsteady, and he let them settle back to their normal height slowly, the way you lower your voice after shouting, slightly ashamed of the volume. He hadn't wanted to do that. Bullying the castle into compliance wasn't how things were supposed to work, not anymore. The whole point of being free was that nothing was compelled. He chose the hearth. The castle chose to stand. Everyone chose and no one forced, and the household operated on voluntary warmth rather than contractual obligation. That was the deal. That was what Sophie had made possible when she'd broken the contract, and what Calcifer had endorsed every day since by staying when he could have gone. But the castle was making it hard. A knock came at the door. A real knock this time, knuckles on wood, human and ordinary. "Come in," Calcifer called, because the alternative was the castle refusing to let the visitor in, and he was not having that fight twice in one morning. The door opened. It opened grudgingly. The hinges moved stiff and slow, the way a person might hold a door for someone they didn't like while making it clear the courtesy was under protest. And Tamsin Bell stepped into the kitchen. She looked better than she had a month ago. The dark circles were mostly gone, and she'd put on enough weight that her sharp cheekbones no longer gave her the look of a woman subsisting on anxiety and competence. She was wearing a grey wool dress with the sleeves pushed up and a knitted scarf wound twice around her neck, and she was carrying a bowl covered with a cloth. "Morning, Calcifer," she said. "Sophie about?" "Stump End," She'll be back this afternoon. Ah. Tamsin set the bowl on the kitchen table. The table tried to slide away from her. She put her hand flat on it and held it steady with the unconscious firmness of a woman who had been managing an enchanted cottage for a month and was no longer impressed by furniture with opinions. The cottage made extra soup. I thought Morgan might like some. Morgan, who had been watching Tamsin with the intense curiosity he reserved for people who were not his parents, not fire demons, and not dream cats, a category that still fascinated him, blew a small green flame in her direction. It was, Calcifer recognized, a flame of greeting. Morgan had a whole vocabulary of flames that nobody in the household had fully decoded yet, though Calcifer was closer than most, on account of understanding combustion from the inside. "Thank you," Tamsin said to Morgan with the careful dignity she used when addressing fire-breathing toddlers. "That was lovely." She straightened. "The cottage has been unsettled this morning, rattling its own shutters. Do you know if—" The castle creaked, not at Tamsin, at the mention of the cottage. The creak came from the wall nearest the front door, the wall that backed up against where Keeper's cottage sat pressed against the castle's side, and it had the distinct quality of a sneer. If stone walls could sneer, which, apparently, they could. Tamsin looked at the wall. "Is that directed at me?" "It's directed at the cottage," Calcifer said. "Your cottage. The castle doesn't—" He tried to think of a diplomatic way to put it. "It's been competitive." Competitive with a cottage? The castle has always been the only building in Sophie's life. Then a smaller, cozier, more emotionally available building showed up and parked itself 3 feet away, and now Sophie spends time in both, and the castle is— He gave up on diplomacy. The castle is jealous. It's been jealous for weeks. It's been moving furniture and locking doors and rearranging stairs and humming through the pipes and generally making everyone's life difficult because it doesn't know how to say "I'm scared you're going to leave me" in any language other than plumbing. The pipes in the wall let out a sound that was halfway between a whistle and a wail. The kitchen table lurched sideways, properly this time, away from Tamsin and toward the hearth. Tamsin watched the table move with the expression of a bookkeeper observing an entry that refused to balance. "Should I not have brought soup?" "The soup is fine. The castle needs to get over itself." Calcifer directed this last part upward, toward the ceiling with deliberate force. "You hear me? The cottage is not a threat. The soup is not a weapon. Tamsin is a person with a bowl, not an invading army." The ceiling creaked. The pipe wail subsided to a mutter. The table stayed where it was, halfway between the hearth and the door, as though it couldn't decide who to be loyal to. Tamsin set the soup bowl on the displaced table with the air of a woman making a point. "I'll come back when Sophie's here, but—" She hesitated. It was unusual for Tamsin to hesitate. She was, in Calcifer's experience, someone who processed information quickly and spoke with precision, the way people did when they'd built their whole identity around being reliable. The cottage has been doing something new. Since yesterday, it's been copying recipes from Gran's old cookbooks, the ones I catalogued. It's been writing them out on the inside of the kitchen cupboard doors, in Gran's handwriting. Calcifer's flames flickered. The cottage is reproducing its memories. That's what I thought. But some of the recipes don't make sense. There's one for comfort broth that includes ingredients I've never heard of. Dried moonwort, powdered hearthite. A cup of— She frowned. A cup of whatever the house remembers about Tuesday mornings in April. That's not cooking. That's magic. Yes. The word came out with the reluctant precision of someone admitting a column didn't add up. I think Gran's recipes were— Some of them might have been spells, disguised as cooking, and the cottage is writing them down because She stopped, started again. Because I asked to understand what Gran was, and the cottage remembers. She left before Calcifer could respond to that, which was probably for the best, because Calcifer didn't know what to say. He was a fire demon, not a grief counselor. He understood combustion and magical theory and the structural properties of various building materials. He did not understand granddaughters discovering their dead grandmother's secrets written in invisible ink on the insides of cupboard doors, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. The castle, as soon as the front door closed behind Tamsin, sealed itself again. Not the nowhere setting this time. The latch simply jammed, the kind of petty obstruction that a building could manage without committing to a full lockdown. Calcifer could feel it, the hinges tight, the bolts stiff, the whole door frame contracted by a fraction of an inch, just enough to make opening it require genuine effort. "All right," Calcifer said. "That's enough." He said it to the castle, not upward, not to the ceiling or the walls or any specific architectural feature. He said it to the castle, to the whole building, the accumulated mass and magic of it, the beams and stones and mortar and the decades of enchantment layered into every surface. He said it the way he'd spoken to the castle in the old days, when it was just the two of them, fire demon and building, heart and body, the long dark hours between midnight and dawn when Hal was asleep and Michael was asleep and the castle walked across the hills in the moonlight, and Calcifer burned alone in the grate, keeping everything alive. "I know what you're doing," he said, "and I know why you're doing it. But this has to stop." The castle went still. Not quiet. A castle was never quiet. There were always settling sounds, thermal contractions, the tick and groan of wood and stone adjusting to temperature changes that Calcifer tracked without effort. But the deliberate sounds stopped. The pipe drone cut off. The vibration in the beams faded. The castle was listening. Calcifer had spent years being listened to by this building. It was a strange thing, being the heart of a house. You couldn't explain it to anyone who hadn't done it. The castle had been built around him, sustained by him, animated by him. His fire had flowed through its walls like blood through veins. He had felt every footstep, every door opened and closed, every change in the weather pressing against the outer walls. He had moved the castle across the hills, not walking exactly, but burning in the direction of movement, like an engine that ran on falling star magic and a stolen human heart. He had hated it. For years he had hated it. The confinement, the obligation, the unbreakable contract that kept him burning whether he wanted to or not. The hearth had been a prison. The castle had been a cage. Every night when the stars came out above the hills and the castle walked beneath them, Calcifer had looked up through the chimney and remembered what it felt like to be up there, to be falling, to be free. And the remembering had been the worst part, worse than the binding, worse than the servitude, because you could endure being trapped if you forgot what freedom tasted like. But Calcifer had never been able to forget. And then Sophie had broken the contract, and he'd been free, and he'd stayed. He'd stayed. Not because of obligation, not because of habit or comfort, or the absence of a better option. He'd stayed because the hearth was warm and the household was his, and he had, without planning to and without anyone's permission, become attached to these ridiculous, complicated, infuriating people and the ridiculous, complicated, infuriating building they lived in. He chose it. Every morning he woke up in the grate. He chose it again. That was what freedom meant, the choosing. "Listen to me," he said to the castle. His voice was low, more crackle than sound. Midnight, who had been cleaning herself on the hearth rug, raised 3 of her 6 eyes. Morgan, in his high chair, went quiet, as though even a toddler could feel the shift in the room's temperature. "I was your heart for a long time. You remember that." The castle remembered. Calcifer could feel it, a slow, deep pulse in the foundations like a building's version of a heartbeat. Not his heartbeat anymore, but the echo of it, stored in the stone. "I was here every night, every morning. I never left. I couldn't leave. That was the deal. That was the contract. You never had to worry about whether I'd come back because I had no choice about staying, and you got used to that." He let his flames rise, steady and blue. "You got used to having something that was always there, something that couldn't go away. And then the contract broke and I stayed anyway, And Sophie came and she stayed, and you thought that was how things would be forever. Constant, guaranteed. A creak, one single creak, from the main beam above the kitchen, slow and long. Acknowledgement. But people aren't contracts, Calcifer said. People leave. They go to Stump End and Kingsbury, and they answer letters, and they visit other buildings, and they come back, you impossible heap of rocks. They come back every time. But you have to let them go first. You can't seal the doors. You can't rearrange the stairs. You can't hum through the pipes until everyone's ears hurt. That's not how you make someone stay. That's how you make them want to leave. The silence that followed was architectural, dense with load-bearing emotion. Calcifer waited. He was a fire demon. He understood waiting. Stars waited for billions of years before they fell, and fires waited in the grate every night for the first person to come down in the morning, and the waiting was part of the burning, not separate from it. The castle spoke, not in words, in the only language it had, the language of itself. A shudder ran through the floor, from the kitchen to the conservatory to the bathroom and back. The pipes let out a single note, not the drone, not the humming, but a clear, sustained tone that hung in the air like a bell struck once and allowed to fade. The front door's latch released with a soft click. The kitchen table, marooned between hearth and door, slid slowly back to its proper position. And then the castle did something it had never done before. The ceiling above the hearth, the solid stone ceiling that had been there as long as Calcifer had been in residence, unchanged and unchangeable, opened. Not shattered, not collapsed, not broken. It opened, like a flower, the stones separating and folding back on themselves with a grinding grace that was half magic and half the memory of a building that had once walked across hills and knew how to rearrange its own body when it chose to. The stones pulled apart and left a gap, not large, perhaps 2 feet across, and through the gap Calcifer could see the sky. Grey sky, February sky. The same flat, unremarkable sky he'd stared at from the hilltop near Stump End 2 weeks ago, when Sophie had carried him in the glass bowl and he'd looked up and felt something he couldn't name and refused to discuss. The sky was there, right there, open above his flames for the first time since the castle was built, since the hearth was made, since a falling star had been caught in the palm of a boy's hand and placed in a grate and told stay. Calcifer's flames went white. He couldn't help it. The sky did that to him, pulled the color out of his fire and replaced it with something older, something from before the fall, before the hearth, before the contract. White gold, like starlight, like what he'd been before he was what he was now. Morgan said, "Ooh." Midnight lifted her head, and all 6 eyes went wide, reflecting Calcifer's white light in 6 separate violet pools. The sky was very far away. The sky was always very far away. But through the gap in the ceiling, with the February wind touching his flames, that intimate, personal touch of moving air against fire that he'd felt on the hilltop and complained about because complaining was easier than admitting what the touch did to him. Through the gap, the sky felt close, closer than it should, as though the castle had not just opened its ceiling but had reached, stretched upward, bringing the sky down to meet the fire demon who couldn't go up to meet it. The castle had given him this, not because he'd asked, not because it was obligated, because, and Calcifer felt this with the thermal certainty of a being who understood heat transfer at a molecular level, because the castle was trying to say something it didn't have words for, something about staying and leaving and the space between them, and the only way it could say it was by rearranging itself. "I understand," the open ceiling said. "You stay, but you miss the sky. I stay, but I miss the constant. We are both buildings with holes in our roofs." This was, Calcifer thought, the most ridiculous metaphor a castle had ever produced, and he was not going to cry about it, because fire demons did not cry. They evaporated, and evaporating in front of a toddler and a dream cat would be deeply undignified. "Thank you," he said. His voice came out as a whisper of flame. "You didn't have to do that." The castle creaked, once, gently. "I know." They stayed that way for a while. Calcifer burning white gold in his grate, the sky open above him, the kitchen warming around them in the natural way that a room warmed when a fire demon was at peace. Not pushed heat, not forced warmth, just the ambient radiation of a flame burning steadily without anger or constraint. Morgan watched the sky through the opening with the uncomplicated wonder of a child who had been born under enchantment and raised by wizards and found everything interesting in roughly equal measure. He blew a small blue flame upward toward the gap, and it rose and flickered out somewhere between the grate and the clouds, a tiny fire reaching for the sky and falling short and not minding. Midnight ate the blue flame's afterimage. She purred. It was a sound like a minor earthquake occurring in a velvet bag. After a while, Calcifer didn't track how long. Time went slippery when the sky was involved, something to do with having existed for millennia before being pressed into a building's service. His flames shifted back from white to their ordinary blue-green, and he said to the castle in a voice that was almost his normal sardonic tone, "You're going to have to close that before it rains." A creak. Amused if Calcifer was reading it right. He was usually right about the castle's creaks. "And you're going to have to let Sophie leave the house without rearranging the furniture every time. She's answering letters. She's helping people. That's what Sophie does. She helps things. She helped you. She's not replacing you. The cottage next door is a community space, not a rival." A longer creak, less amused, grudging. "And Tamsin is allowed to bring soup. Soup is not an act of war." A pipe let out a small reluctant gurgle that might have been agreement or might have been the plumbing expressing an unrelated opinion. With pipes you could never be certain. "I'm not going anywhere either," Calcifer said. He said it quickly, almost carelessly, the way he said things that mattered too much to say slowly. "I have the portable hearth. I can go outside. I'm going to go outside again. I'm going to look at the sky again, probably more than once, and it's going to make me feel things I don't want to talk about, and I'm going to come back. Every time. I'm going to come back to this hearth and burn in this grate and argue with your pipes and complain about the bathroom and keep this household warm. Not because I have to, because this is where my people are." The castle settled. Calcifer felt it, the tension in the beams easing, the vibration fading, the whole building exhaling in the way that buildings exhaled, which was a slow, subliminal release of structural strain that most humans would never notice, and that a fire demon felt like the unclenching of a fist, not fixed. Things like this didn't get fixed in a morning, but something had shifted, a hairline crack in the wall of the castle's fear, a fraction of a degree of warming. Enough. Enough for now. The ceiling began to close. The stones folded back into place with the same grinding grace they'd shown opening, sealing the gap, shutting out the February sky. The last thing Calcifer saw through the narrowing opening was a single bird, a starling, small and dark and ordinary, crossing the grey sky in a straight line from somewhere to somewhere else, not falling, not stopping, just flying. The ceiling closed. The kitchen was a kitchen again. Morgan threw porridge at midnight, who accepted it as her due. "If anyone asks," Calcifer said, settling into the familiar warmth of his grate, the familiar weight of the castle around him, the familiar sound of Morgan's cheerful combustion and midnight's cosmic purring and the pipes settling back into their ordinary argumentative murmur. "Nothing happened. I didn't have a conversation with the building. The building didn't open its roof. Nobody felt anything. We sat here and burned and ate porridge, and that's all." The castle creaked. "Shut up," Calcifer said. "I'm being dignified." The castle, with what Calcifer could only describe as architectural amusement, moved the kitchen table 1 inch to the right. Just 1 inch, just enough to be noticed. A joke, not a threat. A building learning, clumsily, slowly, the way buildings did everything, to be playful instead of desperate. "Oh, very funny," Calcifer said. "Hilarious. A real comedian. I'm trapped in a house with a toddler comedian, a cat who eats dreams, and a castle that thinks it's developed a sense of humor. My life is a masterpiece of cosmic irony, and I want it noted that I chose this freely." He was still burning blue and warm and steady when Sophie came home. She arrived in the late afternoon, boots muddy, cheeks red from the cold, the fox charm on her wrist pulsing with the residual warmth of whatever magic she'd been near. She had the slightly distracted look she got when she'd been doing the thing she was always going to do, and hadn't yet admitted to herself how much she cared about it. She hung up her coat, checked on Morgan, scratched midnight behind her third ear, and came to the hearth. "How was the castle today?" she asked. She asked this every time she came home now, the way you'd ask after a difficult relative. "Fine," Calcifer said. "Quiet." Sophie looked around the kitchen. The table was in its proper place, mostly. The pipes were silent. The front door had opened smoothly for her, without resistance or grudging stiffness. The stairs, when she'd come up from the entrance, had led directly to the kitchen without any detours through the conservatory. "Really," she said. That's the first time it's been quiet in weeks." "Like I said, fine." She gave him a look. It was the look she gave when she knew there was more to a story and was deciding whether to push. Sophie's looks were, in Calcifer's professional opinion, the most effective weapons in her arsenal, more powerful than her gift for talking life into things, more dangerous than her characteristic bluntness. A Sophie look could make a wizard confess his feelings, a fire demon reveal his loyalties, and a castle rethink its entire behavioral strategy. But she didn't push. She just said, "Tamsin left soup," and went to heat it up. The castle let her heat the soup without moving the pot or rearranging the stove or humming through the pipes. It behaved for the first time in weeks like an ordinary building, solid, warm, present. Doing the thing that buildings did, which was to be a home for the people inside them, without commentary or complaint or architectural commentary. It wouldn't last. Calcifer knew that. The castle would get jealous again. The pipes would start humming. The furniture would migrate. That was who the castle was. A building that had been alive too long and felt too much, and didn't know how to trust that the people who warmed its rooms would keep coming back. But maybe, not today. Maybe today was enough. Later, after dark, when Sophie was upstairs putting Morgan to bed and Midnight was prowling the conservatory eating stray bad dreams that had gotten tangled in the starlight orchids, Calcifer sat in the hearth and thought about the sky. He could still feel it. The gap was closed, the ceiling was solid, the stones were sealed, but the memory of the opening was there in the mortar like a fingerprint, a record of the moment the castle had chosen to reach upward and the fire demon had chosen to look up, and they had been for a few minutes, two things that belonged to the ground, acknowledging that the sky still existed and was still beautiful and was still impossibly, heartbreakingly far away. The castle creaked, a soft creak, a good-night creak. "Good night," Calcifer said, and burned, and the house settled around him like a coat that has been worn so long it fits without trying. And somewhere outside, in the dark, Keeper's cottage breathed its slow breath, and the witch's roses climbed another inch, and the stars he had been, the stars he remembered, the stars he would never be again and did not on most days want to be. The stars burned on above Market Chipping in the cold February sky, and Calcifer burned on below, and between the two of them the castle stood, creaking, imperfect, alive, and for one night at least, not afraid.